All right, today we're going to talk about Al-Ghazali, one of my favorite Arabic philosophers. He has a ton of personality, and I'm calling him here the anti-philosopher philosopher. One of the things that he wrote that we're going to be talking about today is called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. So I feel bad almost to call him a philosopher, but this is falling into a tradition where there were those focused on kalam, from which we get the kalam cosmological argument, if you've ever heard of that. Those focused on kalam have a more closely knit approach to philosophy connecting to theology, and the idea of investigating the ways of God as going alongside investigating the ways of the world. And those who were called the Philosophers, obviously coming from the same root as the Greek word philosophy. And these people were often more willing to stretch it a little bit, to take a little bit of distance from the religious orthodoxy, to explore what they thought to be true in a fundamental way, and then see if they could reconcile that with the religious orthodoxy. So Al-Ghazali, he's coming along after Avicenna or Ibn Sina, long after Al-Farabi, and in the period that in Europe we're starting to see a little bit of scholasticism at this point. Al-Ghazali lived in various places: Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem. He was a famous scholar there, highly respected scholar. Had a huge amount of pull in the courts of caliphs, in the courts of sultans, but famously, and he describes this in his autobiography, he gave it all up and became a Sufi, a mystic. This is a brand of Islam that is more focused on the deep connection, the spiritual connection between the divine and the human. So he steps away from his life's work in order to take this more monastic type journey. Interesting character in all these ways. For our purposes, one of the things we should realize about Al-Ghazali is that he's a lot like St. Augustine, and we often get these comparisons between the two of them. He writes in this confessional mode, in this sort of personal essay type mode, which was very uncommon for the time, at least in the literature that we have. But he tells you his life story, and he assumes that you'll be interested. Obviously, he has a big ego, but he was right. Also something that we could say about St. Augustine. So a little bit of background here in the philosophical world of what was going on. I don't know if you've come across these words before, probably have a little bit in this class. The Mutazilites. This was really the beginning of Islamic philosophy. The Mutazilites were a group of sort of rationalists that came out of the golden age of Baghdad, this era of translation and exciting advances in knowledge. They were known for their rational and careful thinking about everything, but trying to take their religion and to think specifically, how does the way our minds work and the logic that we recognize in understanding the world affect how we relate to religious claims? Now, one interesting thing to find out about these very early Islamic thinkers is that they were atomists, somewhat in the tradition of Democritus and Epicurus from the ancient world. They thought atomism was a fundamental way of understanding the universe, and that these atoms that God made moved in ways that made properties apparent to us when the atoms combined. But the properties of the atoms themselves were very simple distinctions from one to another, and all the different things that we see and experience come from those combinations. I mean, this is pretty close to what we believe in our modern physical theories, really. They put a big emphasis on free will and said that there can be no justice if God determines in advance what's going to happen to us. So just as, if you're familiar with, in the Christian scriptures, there are scriptures that seem to say that some people are predestined to heaven, and some scholars think that that implies that some are predestined to hell. In the Quran, there are scriptures that appear to read like saying that some people are predestined to heaven and some people are predestined to hell. And God effects in them that which he chooses for them as what is worthy of them. Mutazilites think this is a misreading. They think that we can understand these texts, certainly the Quran, to make it consistent with the idea that God would not reward or punish anyone who did not freely choose, freely have the option to do what they did. They believed in divine simplicity. This is a core teaching in all of Islam, but they took it to the next level, as it were. So they said, if God is simple, then it cannot be meaningful to talk about God as having properties. When we say God is loving, we're not really saying something strictly true. That is to say, God is loving seems to imply that there's God and then there's God's love, and that these are separate entities. Instead, God is simple, God is one, and any words that we can say about God are simply insufficient analogies to get at the oneness, something about the one character that God has that is not divided into God's love and God's judgment or whatever, or God's intelligence or whatever else God has, right? God doesn't actually have any of those things. God just is this one thing. So that's what they take. That's the approach they take. And as we'll see, that the Al-Ash'ari philosophers don't subscribe to that. They also thought the Quran is not eternal. Seems like on a surface reading you might say, well, of course the Quran is not eternal, but this was a big debate at the time. But they think the Quran came into being when God inspired God spoke to Muhammad through the angel. So they think that that's when it came into being, that it wasn't an eternal text that just transitioned its way into the mind of Muhammad and the written word. And the sort of rivals that came around after the Mutazilites are the Al-Ash'arites. And Al-Ghazali is taught by an Al-Ash'arite, and he is very much working in this tradition. So these are the followers of Al-Ash'ari. They believed that there was a problem at the core of Mutazilite philosophy and theology, that they were not using reason to understand the ways of God. Instead, they were letting reason carry the water. Reason decides everything that can be decided by reason, and then we'll let revelation come in after the fact and shore up or poetically describe some of the things that we discover from reason. The worry here is an old worry, right? This is a worry that was present earlier with authors like Tertullian, right? One has Athens to do with Jerusalem. Why are we bringing in, why are we sort of presenting the philosophy of Aristotle or the philosophy of Plato and putting some, Christian or Muslim or Jewish decorations on it and then calling it faith, right? This is their issue here. We need to let revelation play its proper role, which isn't getting rid of reason or making reason unnecessary, but rather making reason subservient. So the Al-Asharites were also atomists, but they didn't think that the atoms were as it were, God set them in motion and then was just letting them do their thing, knowing in advance what they might do, perhaps. But instead, they were occasionalists about atoms, so that everything that happens to the atoms happens through the direct will of God. What people might want to call free actions are actions that God enables by both making the individual who does the thing, and when that individual chooses, which God knew in advance and predestined, right? They're believers in this sort of harder form of predestination. When the individual chooses the thing that God knew that they were going to choose and made them to choose, though God doesn't choose for them. God is not the author of sin here, but you can see how they're going to have to finesse it a little bit. God is involved in all the movement of the atoms that follows from the human choice. They were voluntarists, which means that when they encountered, if you've heard of the Euthyphro dilemma, is goodness good because God made it good, or did God recognize that it was good and then indicate to us it is good? They say that goodness is what it is because of God's explicit will. They didn't want to say arbitrary will, but it feels a little bit arbitrary to talk about divine voluntarism. And they're going to be compatibilists about free will. They're going to say, yes, people have free will, but their actions are determined by God creating them that way. But when we say that they're acting freely, it just means that there's no, obstacle, physical obstacle, external obstacle that stands in their way. So, for example, you might say, if you're an Al-Asharite, God made me so that I would, in the proper circumstances, make this video. And so, even though I don't have ultimate control over it, I am making the video freely because, there's no one like banging at the door telling me to stop. My computer isn't fritzing so that I can't do anything, so on and so forth. The things that would stand in the way of my freedom are obstacles in the material world, basically. And Al-Asharites believed in an eternal Quran. Obviously, there's some diversity of thought here. These are really rough generalizations, but this is something that was the general belief in this group. So, as I said, Al-Ghazali is connecting with the Al-Asharites and that school. But something very unique and something I appreciate a great deal about the man is that he gives his opponents a great deal of his skill in doing philosophy when he describes what they think fairly, in a detailed way, in a thoughtful way, in almost a sympathetic way. But I want to flag that, because when he does this, he can also be very acerbic. He can be very sarcastic. He can be very sharp. But he doesn't distort what they think. So he's responding to a lot of the things that Aristotle wrote he's responding to a lot of the things, especially that Ibn Sina wrote or that Al-Farabi wrote. And he disagrees with them about a lot, not about everything. In fact, he could be seen as a sort of bridge between the Al-Asharites, and Ibn Sina's the Falsafa. But when in doubt, he leans toward the more theological, more orthodox Al-Asharite approach. But he does amazing scholarship in presenting his opponent's positions, and it makes him really a good read if you're trying to understand in an overview what was going on at the time and how people were responding to each other. There are now I'm going to talk for the rest of the time about the incoherence of the philosophers, and then a great thing about the incoherence of the philosophers is after Al-Ghazali wrote, there's another author. This author, Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, lived in the Iberian Peninsula, so that's modern-day Spain and Portugal. He lived there, and he wrote a response to the incoherence of the philosophers called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. Gotta love it. Okay, they're responding to each other. They're pushing back against each other. So here are three claims that G I put G there, but Al-Ghazali objects to. He objects, and this is in the Incoherence of the Philosophers. He objects to the claim that the universe has an eternal past. He objects to the claim that God has no knowledge of particulars, and he objects to the claim that there is no resurrection of the body. All of these things, which look pretty, far removed from Muslim orthodoxy and might make an Orthodox Muslim feel kind of uncomfortable, Al-Ghazali says, yeah, and we don't even rationally have to believe them. There's no rational argument that forces us to believe these things. And maybe there's a rational argument that says that we have to not. So he's going to problematize all these things. Now I'm going to summarize just sort of small portions of what he says on each of these examples. First of all, he objects to the claim that the universe has an eternal past. Ibn Sina and Aristotle thought that the universe was co-eternal with God, but caused by God. So there was a causal dependency relationship, but not a time dependency relationship. The basic idea here is that as long as God has existed, God has been God. And so God has been creative. God has been generous. And therefore, there would be something existing, sort of spinning off from God, no matter what, all the time. Now, this seems to go against the Quran, seems to go against the Bible. The natural reading thereof says that, God created, there was nothing, and then God made stuff. Well, actually, the natural reading often seems to say something like there was like formless stuff, and then God formed it. So maybe that's a little different. That's worth thinking about, and in fact, Ghazali and other authors try to make hay from that. But this is a more formal way of looking at Ibn Sina's argument for the eternal universe. He says, suppose God preceded the world temporally. We're going to assume what we try to disprove. Then, before the existence of the world, the cause of the world existed. Now, when a cause sufficient to create an effect exists and has no external barrier, the effect will also exist. So if you have the assembly line and it's spitting out, one Keebler cookie after another, and if you have the assembly line working and you have all the dough and you have everything together and there's nothing interfering with the functioning of the assembly line, you'll get another cookie there. That's the basic idea. And then he says there can be no effective external barrier to God. Nothing out there is going to stop God. Therefore, the effect came from the cause eternally. That is to say, before the existence of the world existed. Now, that's not going to work out very well. Before the existence of the world existed, right? This is a contradiction. Therefore, we throw out our first premise. So this is called reductio ad absurdum argument. You assume something, develop a contradiction, and then determine that the assumption is false. So we reject the first premise. Therefore, God did not precede the world temporally. The universe is eternal. Now, Al-Ghazali's response to this argument is interesting. He says, well, you ask the question, why did God create at this time instead of another time? And then he wants the respondent to come up with, he wants Ibn Sina to come up with an a priori proof. This means a proof without sensory evidence, without experiential evidence. How do we know, with just the exercise of our minds, that God couldn't create at a certain time without a contradiction? So we need some sort of argument that says, that has a conclusion. When a cause sufficient to create an effect exists and has no external barrier, the effect will also exist. Can you find those premises? In fact, he wants to claim that what you're doing here is you're coming up with a premise that you think is a priori evident, self-evident. Number 3, to be self-evident. But he says that there's no contradiction in believing number 3 to be false. There's no contradiction in thinking that God's just, doing nothing. All, just God and nothing else around. And God's like, should I create right now? Nah. I'll do it now, right? There's no contradiction in that. We might ask, well, why now rather than then? But that the fact that we have a question doesn't imply that 3 is true. He has a number of other things that he says. Obviously, this is just providing a sketch. Now, on God's knowledge of particulars. This is a, these are technical terms, right? What is a particular? What is a universal? Well, we've probably talked about this a little bit. But a particular is one individual object. For example, the orange sticky note. The orange sticky note has in common with everything else that is orange its orangeness, and has in common with everything else that is a sticky note its sticky noteness. But this particular sticky note is one sticky note. We can count it. That is what a particular is. The universal is the thing that is in many different places at once. So in this sticky note, and in this sticky note, and in, my orange shirt at home, all the different places that there are orange. So Ghazali says, if God doesn't know particulars, if God doesn't know the particular, who is Dan? Well, he wears glasses. He's got sort of reddish hair that's becoming brown or gray. Whatever. Sometimes has a beard, sometimes doesn't have a beard. If God doesn't know the particulars, God would be quite ignorant of the world. God is supposed to know everything, but God wouldn't know very much at all. And God wouldn't know things about salvation history. God wouldn't know the details about Muhammad and what distinguishes Muhammad from other men or from other human beings. So this is pretty significant for Al-Ghazali. This is the argument that Ibn Sina, following Aristotle again, has about God's knowledge. I'm going to use the example of Amun-Ra St. Brown to make this point. Now, when Ghazali makes this argument for Ibn Sina, He actually uses this character named Zaid, so I'm keeping Zaid here, but Ghazali does not talk about Amun-Ra St. Brown, believe it or not, the Lion's receiver. So if at T1 I know that Zaid will prank Amun-Ra St. Brown, and at T2 I know that Zaid is pranking Amun-Ra St. Brown, it's not true at T1 that I know that Zaid is pranking Amun-Ra St. Brown, because that's going to happen in the future. So it's false that Zaid is pranking Amun-Ra St. Brown at that time, T1. So now consider, if God has knowledge of particulars, then from T1 to T2, God must change from not knowing a certain proposition to knowing it. But God never changes. Therefore, God has no knowledge of particulars. Pretty straightforward argument, but Ghazali has a problem. He says that, first of all, he says, look, God knows everything, folks. Let's stop getting caught up in these details. But he respects Ibn Sina's argument, and so he addresses it directly. He says knowledge of particulars is relational. We might say, in this case here, God is not a character in the relation. My knowledge that a cat is behind me doesn't change when the cat goes in front of me. What changes is the cat. I remain the same. I have a relationship of knowledge here. So I guess I shouldn't say God is not a character in the relationship, but God is not a character in the change, right? The change happens independently of God's nature. God's nature remains the same. God's characteristics remain the same. And God, being outside of time, as it were, recognizes the truths at each particular time. There is no point in time where God both knows and doesn't know something. So God knows all things from a unique and cosmic perspective, while God remains the same. The third example here, the resurrection of the body. Again, the resurrection of the body is entailed by straightforward readings of the Quran. But if we remember back to Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and the works of Plato, the body is, a pretty despised thing in a lot of the intellectual writings of this period. So we can have someone like Ibn Sina or other Islamic philosophers draw upon quotations from Muslim scriptures like this one. I have reserved for my virtuous worshippers what no eye ever saw, no ear ever heard, and which never occurred to the heart of man. This is in keeping with Plato's sort of ideas from the Phaedo, where when we get free of the body, then we will be philosophers in truth. Then we will be able to commune with the forms. And everything that attaches us to the body is a thing that keeps us from what really matters, that keeps us from the pleasures that really matters, from the joy that really matters, from the connection, the relational connection with God and one another that really matters. That the body is an obstacle. And so, Ibn Sina thinks, there will be no body in the afterlife. We will be free from the body. Al-Ghazali says, no. First of all, both the scriptures sort of say there's going to be a body there, but we can see how it fits. Again, he wants to say, show me the a priori arguments that this is a problem. Try and make an argument. Let's look at this argument. Let's try and prove that there's no bodies in the afterlife. Here's an argument. The pleasures of spirit are superior to the pleasures of the body. Ghazali admits that. He's willing to agree to that. Number 2, the blessed dead will have unsurpassable pleasures. He's willing to agree with that. Conclusion, therefore, the blessed dead will not experience any pleasures of the body. But 1 and 2 don't determine that 3 is true. They don't imply 3. 1 and 2 could be true, with 3 being false. So where do we get the argument for 3? It is true that the blessed dead will have unsurpassable pleasures, Ghazali admits, but he thinks that that just means that they will have the pleasures of spirit. But why not the pleasures of body too? There's no argument present. In some ways, Al-Ghazali is anticipating, despite his sort of theistic preoccupations, or his theistic beliefs, deep-seated beliefs, and his focus on theological topics, he's anticipating people like David Hume, who will problematize deeply metaphysical argument by the philosophers or the metaphysicians that seem to arise from premises that the philosophers themselves don't defend. They just take to be self-evident. So yeah, little introduction to Al-Ghazali. Really interesting philosopher. I encourage you to read as much of his stuff as you have an appetite for. I think it's really good. He's one of the easiest to read philosophers of this time period, and really of any time period. So have a good one.